My grandparents always picked my cousin over me. For most of my life, I was their backup plan, until I refused to follow the life they had planned for me. Now, they want to act like the perfect family, but I've lived with them since I was little. My parents died when I was young, and if my grandparents hadn't stepped in to adopt me, I likely would have ended up in foster care. I've always been grateful to them for that. They sacrificed so much, especially considering how old they were when they took me in. Raising a child at their age couldn't have been easy, but they did it. They were strict, really strict, but in a way, I can't complain. They gave me a life when I otherwise might have had nothing. They treated me as their own, but they also tried to control my every move, whether it was the way they fed me, dressed me, or even the things I was allowed to like. I didn't get much of a say. I always felt like my wants and opinions didn't matter. Growing up, I never argued with them. I was too scared. I feared they might one day send me away, and I couldn't imagine what would happen if I had no family at all. They weren't cruel, but they were distant, emotionally unavailable. I know it was probably a generational thing, but their love always felt conditional, and I never felt secure in it. They raised me, yes, but there was always this unspoken expectation that I would follow their rules, without question. I obeyed. I thought they knew best. I looked at my cousins and their toys, their superhero costumes, and I felt jealous, but I told myself it was for my own good. They must have had a reason for not buying me those things. They said I didn't need them. It wasn't until I got older, though, that I started to see things differently. The control they had over me had always felt natural to them, like it was the only way they knew how to parent. But as I matured, I realized how deeply it was affecting me. I resented that I had to follow their every command. I hated myself for constantly agreeing, but I still did it. I was afraid that if I didn't, I would end up all alone, without anyone to turn to. This continued until high school. That's when the anger I'd been suppressing for so long boiled over. I had always wanted to go to art school, but my grandparents had other plans. They didn't even try to understand my passion, they just demanded that I study something they thought was more practical, like economics. That was the moment when I finally snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to make my own choice, even if it meant standing up to them. I had never defied them before, and they were just as shocked as I was when I told them I wasn't going to follow their path. But it was too late. I had finally found the courage to take control of my own life. They didn't take it well. After that, they completely shut me out. They ignored me during the last days of high school, refusing to acknowledge my decisions. They didn't even attend my graduation. I was the only one there, standing alone while the other kids had their parents cheering them on. That's when it hit me, they weren't really my parents. I had always thought of them that way, but they didn't see me the same. If they did, they would have put aside our differences to be there for me on the most important day of my life. The truth slowly sank in. I was just a project to them. They wanted me to be perfect, to fit into the mold they'd created for me. They were kind to me as long as I followed their rules, but the moment I made a decision they didn't approve of, they distanced themselves. It was heartbreaking, but it was the truth. It took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that their love had strings attached. My love for them was unconditional, but theirs had conditions. They never spoke to me after graduation, not when I left for college, and not in the days that followed. It was clear, I was no longer a part of their plan. I got used to the distance after a while. I was, in a way, an orphan, so it wasn't entirely unexpected that I'd end up without family. But coming to that realization was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I'd spent my whole life idolizing my grandparents, believing they'd saved me, given me a home. To accept that they no longer cared about me, that they had no interest in being a part of my life, was crushing. They never reached out after I left for college. I still saw them at family gatherings, though. My uncles and aunts didn't hold anything against me. They never judged my choice of college. To them, I was still part of the family. They would invite me to dinners and reunions, and I would attend, even though I knew my grandparents were never happy to see me. They ignored me for the most part, or would make small talk as though we were distant acquaintances. I spent my time talking to my cousins, trying to keep the peace, and would leave early to avoid any uncomfortable tension. The awkwardness between my grandparents and me was always palpable, but I learned to live with it throughout college and even into my graduation. When I called them to tell them I'd landed my first real job, I expected them to be happy for me. But they weren't. I had worked hard for years, and after graduation, I landed a high-paying job as an art consultant, something I'd always dreamed of. But it wasn't good enough for them. They still couldn't accept me for who I was or the career I'd chosen. That phone call left me feeling emptier than ever. I'd clung to the hope that if I became successful enough, if I earned enough money, they'd finally accept me. But that hope was shattered in a moment. They didn't care about me, not really. They couldn't see past their own expectations, and I knew at that point that nothing would ever make them forgive me for choosing my own path. After that, I stopped calling. They never reached out to me either, so I had no reason to keep trying. Then one day, my grandmother called me. At first, I thought maybe they were finally ready to resolve things. I didn't know if I wanted that, but the idea of reconciling was bittersweet. My life had been peaceful without them, but I couldn't help feeling like a terrible person for even thinking about it. When I arrived at their house, I was greeted by the whole family. It was another gathering, just like before, with everyone there, except this time, my grandparents had a surprise. They were about to read their will. I had always known they were getting older, but hearing them talk about preparing for the end felt like a punch to the gut. They told us they wanted to make sure everything was settled. As I listened, I assumed I would inherit the house. I had always wanted it, and they had promised me I would get it. It held all my memories, my parents' belongings, the furniture my mother had chosen, everything that tied me to a past I never fully got to experience. I thought the house was mine. But when they got to that part of the will, they blindsided me by giving the house to my cousin instead. I was speechless, standing there in shock. All my cousins were looking at me, confused, because everyone knew the house was supposed to be mine. Finally, I found my voice. I asked them why, and they told me they wanted to give it to their oldest grandchild, my cousin. I reminded them of their promise. I told them how much that house meant to me. I had spent my entire life thinking it was my home, that it was the one thing that tied me to both my parents and my grandparents. But they didn't care. They said I could have had it if I had listened to them and chosen a respectable career. They told me I'd embarrassed them by following my own dreams. They said I didn't deserve anything of theirs. In that moment, I saw everything clearly. The oldest grandchild excuse was just a cover. They were punishing me for not living according to their plan. The house wasn't about me at all. It was about their need for control. I lost all respect for them in that instant. I had always wondered if they were capable of being good parents, but now I realized that maybe they weren't even good people. I left without saying another word. What was left to say? But over the next few days, sadness turned to anger. How could they take the one thing I wanted most and act like I didn't matter? Maybe it was time to accept that they were better off without me, just as I was without them. They were perfectly happy with their decision, and I needed to move on. They had made it clear that they didn't want me in their lives. The only connection I had left to them was the bills I had been paying for years. I took care of everything, utilities, food, medicine, and they never once asked me about it. They probably assumed one of my uncles was taking care of it. But I realized I couldn't continue being part of their lives if they didn't even acknowledge what I was doing for them. It was eating me alive, so I canceled all the payments as the first step in truly severing ties. It took them 18 days to figure out what I had done. When they finally called, I expected them to be angry. But instead, they were polite, even cordial. They said we should be a family again, that my absence had been unbearable for them. It took me less than 30 seconds to realize what was really happening. They didn't want me back in their lives, they just wanted me to resume paying their bills. Their egos were too big for them to admit they needed me. I told them I wasn't interested in being a family again, and I hung up. Was I wrong to shut them down without giving them a chance to explain? Maybe. But I wasn't going to let them manipulate me again. Update 1. It's been a few days since the call. I've wondered if I was too hasty in cutting them off. Maybe they didn't want me to pay their bills, they just wanted me back in their lives. But they didn't try to contact me after that one call, and I was still angry. They had taken the house away from me, and that was a wound that hadn't healed. Despite everything, part of me still wanted to help them with their bills. And that was the ridiculous part. After all they had done, I still wanted to help them. But I realized I didn't owe them anything. My grandfather had a pension. They had enough money. They didn't need my help. I wanted to help them, but I also wanted peace. And if they weren't going to try for a real relationship, then I needed to let go, for good. Update 2. I honestly didn't know what I did wrong, but the guilt was keeping me awake at night. The thought that I might be the reason our relationship was beyond repair gnawed at me, but I didn't call them. They called me. After about a month, my grandmother's voice was cold, accusing me of being heartless and selfish. It hit me like a slap in the face, and before I knew it, tears were welling up. I asked her what I had done wrong, and she scoffed. She told me that I stopped paying their bills because they wouldn't give me the house. I was stunned. All I could say was, "I'm sorry," and offered to start paying their bills again if that was what they wanted. But she cut me off. "We don't need anything from you," she said. "We're just letting you know how ungrateful you are. We failed at raising you." Her words were so cruel, and I just listened, numb, as I cried. I've never felt more alone in my life. Update 3. Months passed after that conversation, and I finally decided to try therapy. I had been sinking into depression, and my friends had been urging me to go, but I kept avoiding it. I didn't want to face the truth of everything, but after 2 months of spiraling, I finally made the decision. The therapist helped me uncover something I'd never realized. I had been clinging to my grandparents because I felt like I owed them something. She was right. I felt like I owed them my life because they took me in when no one else would. I had been emotionally manipulated for so long that I didn't even recognize it. They raised me, but in doing so, they instilled this fear in me, fear that if I didn't conform to their expectations, I'd be abandoned. The truth was painful. I wasn't doing things out of love for them. I was doing them out of fear, out of obligation. I had spent my entire life trying to repay them for saving me, but the reality was, they were the ones who caused me harm. They made me insecure, made me believe that I could never be enough unless I followed their rules. For the first time, I understood, I hadn't failed them, they had failed me. Update 4. Eventually, I mustered the courage to face my grandparents. They had always been a constant presence in my life, even if it wasn't a positive one. My other family members were still reaching out, and when my aunt invited me to another gathering, I decided to go. It was a bit of a shock for everyone, since I hadn't shown up in months, but my grandparents, their faces were frozen with shock, and I knew they hadn't expected to see me again. I didn't want to see them either, but I needed closure. If I didn't say my piece, I'd never be at peace. I told my family I wouldn't stay long, just long enough to have a conversation with my grandparents, but when I tried to speak with them privately, they refused. Instead, they insisted that I say everything in front of the family. So, I did. I told them how they had failed me, how they had made me feel like I wasn't good enough, that I owed them for giving me a home. I told them how scared I was as a child, always walking on eggshells, terrified that if I stepped out of line, they would get rid of me. I told them that their love was always conditional and manipulative. They listened to me, and then they exploded. They said I owed them everything. If it wasn't for them, I would have been a homeless orphan. They told me I should be grateful they decided to take me in, that they didn't just leave me like a stray. Their words were so cruel that a couple of my aunts started crying. They said they had given everything to me, and still, I defied them. They had dreams for me, and I hadn't followed them. I was ungrateful. At that point, my cousins spoke up, defending me. They told my grandparents to stop. I was so stunned by the hostility that I couldn't speak, but my cousins had my back. When I could finally speak again, I told my grandparents, firmly and without hesitation, that they were nothing to me anymore. Their version of love was not love at all, it was control. I wasn't going to allow them to dictate my life anymore. Without saying another word, I left. I promised myself I would never see them again. Update 5. It's been months since the fight with my grandparents. True to my word, I haven't contacted them. My uncles, aunts, and cousins reached out, but I kept things brief. I let them know I was okay, but I wasn't ready to let anyone back in. After 8 weeks of isolation, I finally decided to go out with my cousins. They had been pushing me to hang out with them, and they promised they wouldn't talk to my grandparents either. It was comforting to know I had family who wasn't asking for anything, just wanting to be there for me. I was still learning how to trust, how to accept love from people without feeling like I had to earn it. It felt foreign, but also so freeing. My oldest cousin even told me the house was still mine if I wanted it, but I refused. I had the movers pack up my parents' things from the house, but I didn't want the house anymore. The thought of it filled me with dread. It was a place filled with bad memories now. I didn't want to keep holding on to something that had hurt me. For the first time in a long while, I was happy. I was finally free from the toxic grip my grandparents had on me, and my therapist noticed the change in me. She was pleased with my progress. I was finally starting to break free from the chains they had bound me with, and I was taking control of my own life.